Hey guys, Dr. Stitzel here. So today I want to take on this idea of what we learn in economics really isn't very useful early on. And I want to make the point today that actually most of what you learn in Econ 101 is right. So here's a quote from Ezra Klein. There's nothing more dangerous than somebody who has taken their first economics class. I think this sentiment is really common, and I think what Mr. Klein means is that the world is more complex than it's made out to be. The things that you learn in econ classes are too simple, and they're really not applicable to what's going on in the world. There's some truth here, right? The world is more complex than it's made out to be, and in fact that's something that I'm actually going to argue for as we progress in the video. However, the answer to this is not less economic education, but more. The world lacks economic understanding. This comes a lot from policymakers, probably just people that you're going to meet in day-to-day life. We call this class Principles of Economics for a reason. You're learning principles that you can then build on and go forward with. Imagine somebody making this argument about any other class that you take, right? As if there's nothing more dangerous in the world than somebody who just took their first physics class. The understanding of physics and force and moment arms, it turns out to be exceedingly useful, even at the principles level. So I want to go through and make about 10 points here. I'm going to start with one of our foundational lessons, which is that the world is full of both desirable and undesirable unintended consequences. Consequences that are largely invisible, but that even a course in just principles of economics gives us great vision and enables us to see them, to think about them, and to understand them. These unintended consequences, of course, can be good or they can be bad. So I'm not unilaterally arguing that unintended consequences are always a negative thing. Let's take an example, the Cash for Clunkers program. One of the worst political programs, one of the worst policy choices the world has ever seen, probably. So the basic idea here, in the wake of the 2008 crisis, the U.S. government wanted to buy up old cars so that used old cars go out of the market, ostensibly using taxpayer dollars to force people into buying new cars. This had a really negative unintended consequence, which is that many charities actually rely on used cars as donations from people who would be giving to them by soaking up all these used cars and actually increasing demand in the used car market. Think back to our elasticity and our market equilibrium modules that we've just gone over. You actually increased the price, so the cost for people to donate their cars to charity went up dramatically as the price of used cars, because the increased scarcity in used cars started to rise and rise. Alex Tabarrok and Andrew Gelman argue unintended consequences stem from simple systems trying to govern complex systems. Of course, a political system is a simple system which tries to govern society, which is a complex system. So there are always going to be unintended consequences when we engage in policy. But let's think about another thing that is an example of simple systems trying to govern complex systems. That example would be like wildfire management, right? So ecosystems are incredibly complex, and the political systems trying to govern them are very, very simple, almost by design. I mean, governance has to be simple, right? You don't want to go into a system where there's a really convoluted and complex voting system that then doesn't give you clear outcomes, right? Political systems by nature need to be simple. But a lot of times in these cases, fire management reduces the diversity in a ecosystem, causes wildfires to be maybe more rare, but when they do happen, they're much more damaging. They lead to soil erosion, they lead to floods, and they end up getting a lot of individuals and property hurt in the process. We'll always do well to remember in this class that incentives matter, well, more on this later, and that one of the things we should do when we're making policy choices in particular, but anything when we're dealing with a complex system, is to be engaged in humility. Hand in hand with this is the idea that intentions are not results. A good example of this is the Endangered Species Act. So the red-coated woodpecker was an endangered species, and it was one of the animals that they were trying to protect with the Endangered Species Act. But the consequence of this was any habitat, or really potential habitat, for the woodpeckers would then be rendered useless to the owner, because you couldn't you couldn't cut down the trees or clear out the underbrush. We want to protect the habitat for the woodpeckers, which is an admirable thing to do, by the way. But the consequence was anybody owning property in these areas, especially there in North Carolina where the woodpecker is common, was if they even thought that the trees on their property might form a habitat for the woodpeckers, the cost to those landowners was going to be very, very high if they lost their property. They essentially would turn very, very valuable property into worthless property overnight. Those landowners rushed out to cut down the trees and clear out the timber regardless of the prices for that timber that was being cut down so that their property would still have some value. So at this point, I want to interject that opposing a policy does not mean opposing the intention. Many things are well-intentioned. We would like to save endangered species, especially red-coated woodpeckers. But a policy that doesn't do that and, in fact, tears down the habitat and reduces the survivability of a species should be opposed, regardless of what the intentions are. Now, economists often at this point face the opposition. Now, wait a minute, Dr. Stitzel, shouldn't you present the other side of the case? Is this a one-sided class where you're only teaching us one thing? I'm very open to presenting the other side of the case, and if any of you that are taking this class now ever have the opportunity to take my graduate class, you'll see it's actually built around the idea of showing you both sides of each case and letting you decide for yourself. So actually, intellectual conversation is one of the things that I think higher education is predicated on. So let me propose what the other side is. But first I'm going to do that by taking Paul Haynes' summary of what my side is. So there in the yellow, you see what it is that I'm arguing are four of the essential tenets of economics that we're talking about today. One is that nothing is free. Two is that no one can govern another's life better than they can govern their own. Three, intentions are not results. And four, we should always ask, as compared to what? So let me present the other side, and you can evaluate if you think that the things that I'm teaching you here today are that the opposition is worth thinking about. One, nothing is free. Well, what if we take the other side? Some things, or maybe anything, is free. Maybe you can think of the rare example here, but in general, I think nothing is free holds up as quite a good way to think about it, especially once we've learned about opportunity cost. Two, as opposed to no one can govern another's life better than they can govern their own. I suspect few of you would want to defend the notion that there's an elite and noble group of people who know better how to govern the lives of others, except maybe in the rarest of cases, especially normal and healthy adults, right, that don't have perhaps mental limitations. Three, intentions are not results. The opposite of this would be what? That the intention is the only thing that matters, and what actually happens is irrelevant so long as the idea was well-intentioned. I think the red-coated woodpeckers would ask you to reconsider. Fourth, and finally, we should ask as compared to what? The alternative here is to say we take any fact or statistic or stylized fact even as at face value, and we don't provide critical analysis of it. These things that I'm presented here are really free of ideology, thinking about intentions as not results. I would hope that regardless of your political ideology, your economic leanings, whatever it is that you're thinking, that would be an application to the way that you think and the way that you evaluate, especially policies that come to mind. The next thing I would like to teach is that trade-offs, the world is full of trade-offs rather than solutions. This is famously taught by economist Thomas Sowell, who says our world is unavoidably one of trade-offs and not solutions. This is necessarily true because of opportunity cost. And let's think about an example during the early days of the Obama administration. There was a push towards putting tariffs on Chinese tires. An economist pointed out the cost of putting tariffs on Chinese tires is one of trade-offs. It's not a solution that simply protects producers of tires or rubber here in the United States, but rather a tariff on Chinese tires would raise the price of tires in the United States, and the likely outcome of that would be that people would delay replacing their tires, leading to more accidents, more injuries, and potentially even deaths. So remember that when we're evaluating policies. Now, this isn't to say that all these trade-offs are bad. Sometimes a trade-off is worth it, and the trade-offs, the downside, the opportunity costs would be smaller than the potential benefits. But that's something we should keep in mind when evaluating policy. Next, prices are market determined. They are not arbitrary, and they connect millions of strangers to each other in productive ways that almost none of these strangers end up being aware of. Remember, we talked about the idea of prices conveying information. And we talked about the idea, well, prices aren't arbitrary. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking the seller can set the price and the price be whatever they want. I won't rehash that argument here, but if this doesn't ring a bell, remember that there are market forces that will cause an arbitrarily selected price to be moved towards an actual equilibrium price due to market forces. Finally, prices cannot, except under the rarest of circumstances, be controlled by government without causing these unintended consequences that are often the literal opposite of what is desired. So you can't manipulate with prices because it obscures the information that's involved. Remember our coordination lecture from earlier. Next, productive and sustainable complex economic order emerges without design or intention. Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't have rules, and in fact, it's the case that many of the ways that we emergently order ourselves, right, how we relate to each other in society is governed by rules, but those rules should be subject to the emergent order of a particular society. So when governments hand down rules, they should be careful that that's not part of the emergent order, but the way people respond to those will be. Next, people respond to incentives. So we promised that we'd talk about this. We've said this several times before. Incentives matter is one of the main things that we want to teach here in this class. Individuals respond to incentives. Hand in hand with that is that individuals are the ones that act, not collectives. Now groups, collectives, whether that's governments or various ways that people would choose to be grouped as a collective, whether that's your religious identity or a part of your educational process, those will definitely have an impact on the way that you act. But at the end of the day, it's the individual that chooses and the individual that acts and the individual that responds to incentives. Next, I would like to point out that wealth is not fixed, and by the way, it's not money. Each economic transaction that we engage in is mutually beneficial. Consider if I took up golf this past summer, which I did, and my neighbor has an old set of golf clubs he no longer uses. Turns out I have a poorly functioning bicycle in my garage, and he is interested in a trade. He wants to trade. He's more interested in the bicycle and I in the golf clubs. Now, perhaps some of you would say, well, each economic interaction that happens must have a winner and loser. Did Dr. Stitzel get the better of his neighbor, or did his neighbor get the better of him? Well, consider the bicycle has little value to me. Now the golf clubs have value to me. Perhaps they're an upgrade on the ones that they have, or I can simply keep them in reserve so that I don't have to play alone and I can lend someone a set of clubs. Perhaps the bicycle is an upgrade on the one that my neighbor has, or he keeps it in reserve for parts, or he can use the bicycle to lend to somebody else so that he doesn't have to ride bicycles alone when he goes around our neighborhood. Both of us benefited, and that's a measure of the type of wealth that's happened in society. The value of each of those items has increased by being placed in a better situation. I'd also point out, sort of as something of a tangent, that wealth is not held in money or assets, but in our productive capacity. And that includes actually innovations that, if you're taking business classes here in the future, you're almost certain to discuss things like supply side and just-in-time delivery. Those are actually increases in wealth because your wealth can then be held in not having to store things that you can just go to the retailer and purchase, or you can order online and have delivered very quickly. That is a store of wealth for the entirety of society. Next, I'd point out that governments are not made of smarter or better people than those in the private sector. This isn't to say that people in governments or government jobs are necessarily any worse or less motivated than people in public sectors on average. But you taking this course are no less intelligent or noble or well intentioned than the people that end up in government. Finally, I'd like to remind you that the economy is inconceivably more complex than someone with a poor understanding of economics realizes. It's so complex that the promises of people who want to engineer society from the top down almost necessarily have to be delusions. Bring this full circle, which is to say the principles that we're going to learn in this class are going to be taught with the mindset that the economy is complex and we want to use these tools that we have to understand it and to remind ourselves all the while that society, economy, language, these things are complex and emergently ordered in a way that we can't predictably manipulate. F.A. Hayek says it best, the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they know of what they imagine they can design.